incredibly. Now
you're on the internet. It's all there.
So this is probably an incredibly basic question. But going through, this came to me when we were at Easter Vigil, going through all the different readings. And the Genesis reading, I went home and read Genesis again. And it's like, I've heard so many, like there's literalists and there's people. It's just a story.
Right.
But if you're not a biblical literalist, how do you explain the necessity of what Jesus came to do, of purging the original sin?
Right. Okay. So, I think it's first to recognize, I'd like to say that the church takes a very wide interpretation when it comes to Genesis. The question would be, does a Catholic have to take it literally? And the answer to that would be no. A lot of Genesis is not necessarily historical. It's really more of a narrative and trying how to explain something that really can't be explained by natural reason, right? So we have to take a lot of those things seriously. Like for instance, would it really take 7 days to create everything? Right? Yeah, right. Well, the question, there's a logical question you ask, what's a day if the sun hasn't been invented until the 4th day, right?
Exactly.
So part of that's trying to help us understand in a human way how God works. Now, Thomas Aquinas goes in more depth with that to kind of help us understand logically, like that's where we can even say things like evolution, that we can see how that works in God's plan, that God is a processor and maintains these natural laws and works within them for these things to come about, right? And whether that was a 24-hour period or a day just symbolizes a period of time, right? So the question specifically though was, if someone takes it literally,
or if you don't,
right?
I don't take it literally.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily have to. And so the thing is, usually in the church is a both and, right? All the first, and we have to understand too that Genesis is divided up. The first 2 chapters are really 2 different interpretations of the same coin. So Genesis chapter 1 is what we call the Elohist version, right?
I remember that from like
grade school. Yeah. And I think like, I don't know, do you have Brother Mike for Christian? Yeah. Okay. And what he kind of explained it was like the Old Testament was sort of like a it's an interpretation of the history of the particular people that being the Jewish people. So when we look at the Elohist version, what we're really saying there is like this is really an overarching way of showing that God was present and existed before anything else and brought these things into being, right? If you just think that, you're in line with Catholic thought, right? You could say, well, because some people may say, maybe even our fundamentalist brothers, sisters, even some good Catholics would say, well, yeah, but couldn't God have done this all in 7 days and then kind of presented a way for us to kind of being revealed that we would just like understand it as millions of years, but in reality for him it was only 7 days. Yeah, but then why would God try to deceive us that way too, right? So we build these dinosaur bones. So why would God do that? If there was some kind of meaning behind that.
I'm not so far to believe that the dinosaurs were a falsehood. Some people.
Yeah, of course. Well, because like we have to understand too, our faith is also in line with reason, and so what science tells us is maybe the how's, not necessarily the whys and the whats of what's going on. So for those who maybe don't take it literally, we can say, well, of course, this is a way of interpreting God's presence in the very beginning of our creation. And what's kind of interesting, science has kind of shown we can all trace our DNA back to 2 ancestors. So, okay. Now, when it comes to actual what we call the fall, right? So Genesis 1 and 2 is all about creation. It's all about how things come about. Genesis 2 is a little more particular. We call that the Yahweh's version, right? That's really more how God interacts with man and what man's authority, dominion is really given, right? So in Genesis chapter 2, we see that David is naming all the animals, right? And the reason he's doing that, and actually John Paul II in Theology of the Body goes into very great detail. It's a lot, so I understand. And because what he posits, the reason that God allowed Adam to do that, so he could finally realize that none of these things that God created were actually the same as he. And so it was a way for Adam to kind of realize, oh wait, I'm the only one like me. And now I'm alone. And so God, I need some help here. And then God, through that action, creates Eve, right, from Adam. Right? The fall happens in Genesis 3, right? So Genesis 1, 2 is kind of building this full understanding of what man is, man made in God's image and likeness, that they're given this unique capacity for intellect the other creation doesn't have. And because of that, there's a likeness of God in them. And they're designed completely to be in line with God's will, right? So everything that's happening in Genesis 1 and 2, it's all in line with what God wants for humanity. And he has one stipulation, hey, this tree, don't touch that, right? Or don't eat of its fruit. And one may say, well, why would God do that? Why would God put this tree in the middle of the garden and say, well, don't do that? Well, I think we tend to find that in our own experience of why certain tragedies or certain things happen in our lives that don't seem in accord with God's will or seem kind of contrary to it, and we still choose it. Well, part of that is that it's understanding what free will is. That the whole point of that tree in the garden is that man has a free will to either choose God or not.
Right.
And they were designed originally to be in line with that creation, that will of God. And so the fact that they chose something created over God causes an infinite break with God's will, and then also with humanity itself, right? So there's this chasm that's been created by this original sin that was actually working against man's nature completely.
Mm-hmm.
And that action brought in pain and toil,
right,
and all the suffering and death, right? So all that to say is that so was there literally a tree that was said, no, you can't touch that? And well, maybe, who knows, right? What we do know is that there at some point, man in his free will chose something other than God,
right,
and that caused an infinite rift between humanity and God. And so to mend that, because God still doesn't abandon us even when we've abandoned him, he then finds an opportunity at the fullness of creation to bring a son into the picture, right? So again, because of this break, we've also lost some of our original aptitude and sensibilities too, right? That we had this understanding of like original knowledge, which would have been like maybe the way like angels would know things, right? So we don't know because we're in this experience now,
right,
but there could have been this level of like this understanding that was lost because of that rift. And so we had to regain that over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we see that all throughout the Old Testament. There's this constant like cycle of, okay, God and man make a covenant, man breaks the covenant, God punishes them, they convert, and then there's a new covenant established. And part of that is a building up of man's understanding of God's presence in their life to what we call the fullness of time, which happened in reality in the first century in Judah, where man has gotten to this point where they actually have a good understanding of who God is, and now can allow Jesus to become about in our nature to heal that rift, right? Because you could say, well, if you did it right away, well, man would not be in a way of understanding of what's going on there, and so there would be a rejection of it, right?
Because that was going to be a question, like
Yeah.
how did God really know what would be the time?
Well, God would know.
Well, God would know.
Right, but
what is
right.
it? I mean,
But really, what God knows us even intimately more than we know ourselves. So God understood that there had to be a time for us to develop,
right,
to the point where we could actually receive Him in a way that would be good, right? And so part of that was on us. Part of humanity in general, this development of knowledge. And we see that also too in like even we call the natural or pagan religions. They're always understand there's something higher than us. But Judaism kind of took to a point where God is actually a personal God, that God is actually looking out for me. And that even took time. Because we even see this up until the Babylonian exile. That really, up until that point, the Israelites were looking at God as, well, yeah, he's our God.
mm-hmm.
And there's other gods around here. The Moabites had their gods, and okay, fine, but our God's pretty good. He's protecting us. And it wasn't until the exile that man understood, wait a minute, maybe this God is actually a universal God. And we see that in the book of Daniel, right? That God, you have these four brothers that are cast in the fire by Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar, wait, there's this son of man there is protecting them. Oh, he must be the God of all. And that's even seen further in the Persian emperor Darius, or Darius, who kind of realized fully that, oh wait, this God of the Israelite Hebrews, he's actually the God of all. And so because of that, he sends them back to Israel and says, go rebuild. And here's all the stuff you need to go do that. But even then, the Israelites were like taking time. What's kind of interesting about that time period is not all the Israelites were spread out from the diaspora of the Persian Empire. Only about 10% of them actually went back to Israel. Most of them stayed out in the diaspora because they were successful. They were actually, experiencing these things, which like, why do I go back? I'm good here.
What book is that mostly illustrated?
Primarily, that would be in the prophet, was it Nehemiah, Sirach.
Okay.
Yeah, so it'd be like the post-exilic book of prophets.
Okay.
Right. So Daniel kind of gets in that a little bit too. So that's why when the remnant goes back, it takes them. That's why they don't build the temple right away, because they're still trying to figure out, like, how do we set up our own houses, whatever.
Right.
And finally, they build the temple last, and that's kind of also displeases God. He's like, hey, wait a minute, we're to come back here.
Yeah.
So again, we have this level of development of understanding that kind of just happens incrementally over this time period, to the point where finally the Israelite people realize, oh, this God is actually a universal God, and also he wants what's best for me. And so in the context of this, the fulfillment of that, and this is even being taught by the different rabbis and the Pharisees at the time, God then sends the Messiah. He sends his son to be born as in human nature and take upon our sins. But even that's not enough, because if you look at the basically by the point of the Annunciation, we are then saved. Because once Jesus became human in his conception, all that was necessary at that point was shedding of blood, shedding of his particular blood. So even at the birth of Jesus, the severing of the umbilical cord would have saved us.
Okay, I never thought about that.
Yeah. Right. So and that's really, we see that also in the whole understanding of the temple worship. The whole point of the temple worship was to offer the sacrifice, these animal sacrifices, right?
Mm-hmm.
But even then, they were still understanding these still don't get us to where we need to be, right? This is what God is due out of justice, but still, we're not in a state where we can actually be saved to do these things, right? This is the blood of animals. Blood was sacred, but it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to offer you this bull, and now, okay, I can get to heaven now. They had a clear understanding that was not the case, right?
Okay.
But then when his son comes, because that blood is so sacred, all that would be shed for our sake, would then reconcile us with God, because now humanity can offer that sacrifice in the person of Jesus to reconcile us back with God.
I'm still wrapping my head around the umbilical cord, because I often thought, like, since Jesus being a man had free will, if Jesus disappeared into the desert to evade, Pilate and everything, what would have happened?
Right. Well, so we look at the mission of Jesus then as us then even deepen our understanding of who he is, mm-hmm. and the point of his mission, right? Because let's put it this way. Let's say extreme case. Let's say the Virgin Mary aborted him, okay. Right? We'd still be saved, objectively, but we wouldn't know it. Right. Everything culminated up to the point of the passion, death, and resurrection, so that we can understand that is truly God. And not only that, but he did what he did for me. Right. So everything after the Annunciation was directed towards that particular end for Jesus, so that we can know who he was, we can understand God in a deeper way, and then also we can be saved. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting thought about that like, really what was necessary for, once the umbilical cord was severed, yeah, we're good, but we would never know. Right. Yeah. Which also means that really, with church teaching about marriage really comes into play then too, because okay, I can have faith, even if I were there at the Annunciation, I witnessed this angel talking to Mary and said, okay, and Mary ended up saying, nope, done, boom, done, whatever, gets rid of Jesus. I still wouldn't completely understand what the action was. And I could possibly even live my life not necessarily in doing like, good works.
Right.
Even though I have faith, I still couldn't merit my way to heaven because, well, even though I may have understood what happened there, I'm still not following God's will and maybe living a life according to what He wants. Right. So so all this mission of Jesus on earth was directed for us understanding that we have to do good on here on earth, directed by that faith in order to actually merit our way into eternity.
Which is so ironic to me because a lot of the contemporary Christian faiths, from what I gather, is faith is enough.
Yeah, sola fides is the doctrine that came about from the Reformation, right? And so, like a lot goes with sola scriptura. And so, what Luther kind of dictated was, well, yeah, faith alone. That's all you need. But that is counter to the writings of Peter and the Epistle of James, right? Because he says, well, faith without works is dead, right? And so we have an understanding in the Catholic Church that, yeah, faith is necessary and maybe primary, but that should drive you to these good works. And we're kind of understanding through our dialogues ecumenically that really we're kind of saying the same thing. So even our Lutheran brothers say, yeah, you should do good works. Well, then, okay, so then it's not faith alone.
Mm-hmm.
But they would say, well, yeah, but faith should drive those good works. Okay. What we're saying is, yeah, you need both, right? So you can say someone just sits here in faith and lets his brother starve. Well, okay, that's not really great.
Mm-hmm.
And so would we merit the same end if I fed my brother when he was starving and I still had faith as well? Now we would say that you wouldn't necessarily be damned for that, but we probably would spend a little time in purgatory.
Right.
But that's the problem with a lot of our Protestant brothers and sisters. They don't necessarily recognize the doctrine of purgatory.
Right.
And so they would say, well, as long as you have faith, you're good. Okay, so that means you can be a great sinner.
Yeah.
And just you're good to go. Well, I don't think that's what Jesus taught. That's not really what apostles taught either. So it's kind of a theological debate that happens with a lot of our Protestant brothers and sisters. But we would definitely have to say that, yeah, we have to merit. You still have to actually do good in order to actually receive that eternal reward. Yeah, faith is primary. It's important, but it has to be both.
Well, it's basically the thing. I used to listen to pop radio, a lot, and it was good, except for they often piss on transubstantiation.
Yeah.
And very conservative, older pastor, he'd been dead for a long time. You know what I'm talking about? I can't listen.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Well, one day I said this chance, God, I'm Catholic, I think I'm Catholic. Which kind of tied in with the gospel from
John 6. Yeah. Well, that's in John. I mean, Jesus says very specifically in John that you have to gnaw on my flesh and drink my blood. Mm-hmm. Okay, and if you walk, and that's I think the problem too is that a lot of our brothers and sisters of the denominations, they tend to pick and choose and not put things into context. So, which actually happened in John 6, that if you looked at what happened there when he went to the disciples and said, you got to gnaw on my flesh and drink my blood, what do you think? They left.
Right.
And he let them leave. He didn't say, oh, wait a minute, I'm only speaking figuratively, I'm not actually talking about literally. He didn't say that. He even went to his apostles and said, the 12, and said, do you guys want to go too?
Yeah.
Right? Right. But what happened was the apostles stuck around and realized at the Last Supper, oh, this is what you need. This bread and this wine is becoming now your body and blood because you say it so because you're God. And oh, by the way, do this in remembrance of me means that we should do this too. And that's how we're actually gnawing on your flesh and drinking your blood through this bread that's become you. And even Lutherans would still have an understanding of like consubstantiation. So they would say, we call it kind of panation. What they would say is, yeah, look, we understand there's a real presence there, especially our Missouri Synod brothers. They would say, yeah, we understand there's real presence in the Eucharist. We would just say you don't necessarily need a priesthood to do that. But also, it's not necessarily like completely changes its essence from bread to Jesus. There's kind of a amalgamation of bread and God. And it's like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense philosophically, because in anything we see, one nature, when it consumes the other, it takes it over completely. So like, we see that in like when a cow eats the grass, that grass is no longer grass, becomes part of that cow, right? And when we eat that cow doesn't exist anymore. It becomes part of us. And so in the same way that when Jesus subsumes this essence of bread, it wouldn't just be both and. Even though it's possible that God could do that, it wouldn't make sense though to do that. But I think that's the thing. That's why we're making some great strides within our ecumenical discussions, because that's where finding how we're so close with, like, especially our Missouri Synod brothers. That's why there was a lot of hope that the Eastern rites we would actually conform once more within our lifetime. Now what's stopping that now is more political. So in our dialogues, we were talking to the Greek patriarch, and he was representing all of the different Orthodox churches. Well, what happened was Moscow said, well, we don't want to be part of this anymore. We're actually the new Rome, so we're going to break away from you. And so we're trying to get Moscow and Constantinople back together, so we can actually have continue our dialogue. Because the problem is, if we go to Moscow, we're going to alienate Constantinople, and we go to Constantinople, we're going to alienate Moscow. So that just happened in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So it's a struggle.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But even more the Orthodox, tell the story because why not? One of my brother priests, he was at a baptism, and a very prominent Russian Orthodox person was the godmother. And so there was discussion after the baptism, and this woman came to my brother priest and said, "So, Father, what is the difference between us?" He said, nothing really theologically. At this point, it's more political issues. Yeah. And so it's kind of like, yeah, what's going on?
Listen, I went to the Russian Orthodox when I was a kid. I guess I should have taken communion.
I know the excommunication were lifted in 2000. I think we're under JP2, 7/4/2005. Okay. But here's the thing: we would still recognize even before that there was still Jesus,
right? And
we would still caution our people in the Roman Catholic Church if they go visit, like if you went down to the Romanian Orthodox down the street, St. Thomas, or Greek Orthodox at what's that place over there? Something what's that?
I know what you're talking
about. Yeah. You are eligible to receive the Eucharist there because we believe as Jesus. They have valid orders, they have valid sacraments. You would, go to confession to them, fine, great. We would say, but you should also keep in mind their tradition and if they would allow you to too.
Sure.
Right. So in other words, we wouldn't tell you, we would try to advise, don't go up unless you talk to the pastor or get permission from them first, because they have a right, they're still separated. And even though we recognize still the same sacraments, we want to be cognizant of their traditions too. And so they may not want you to come up because we also understand the Eucharist as a symbol of unity.
Is there a situation where Catholics are verboten to receive communion? Is there, if you are visiting another church and they are offering communion, is there
well, you mean so outside of the Orthodox?
Right.
Yeah, so part of that comes down to, do you understand what you're doing? So the issue the same thing with the Orthodox Church, we don't want to bring scandal, right? So that's why I would say, go talk to the pastor before you receive. You're eligible to receive, fine, because we understand the same thing about the Eucharist. When it comes to other denominations, well, we don't understand the same thing about the Eucharist. So if you were to go down to Ascension, they would say, yeah, we understand there's real presence here. They would say, okay, great, that's great, good, but there's not. And the reason being is because they don't have valid orders.
I see.
And so it wouldn't truly be Jesus present because, well, you don't have that charism of the ministerial priesthood. And so you shouldn't in that respect because, well, that's not the same thing. Now, if you're trying, let's say you go to a wedding at a Lutheran church, whatever, and they're distributing communion, and as long as you talk to your pastor and understand this is not the same thing.
Right.
There was an argument made yeah, okay, for the sake of unity,
okay,
maybe not maybe okay. But the question is, will the other Catholics there to see you do that? And would that bring scandal to anybody? So with a lot of these things, it really depends on the circumstances. And so as long as you understand what that is and what it's not,
Okay.
And you're trying to
Putting
do
it in
this
the
kind.
context.
Exactly right. Yeah. So like you said, like really in reality, you're just drinking wine and eating a piece of bread.
Right on.
Okay, as long as you're aware of that and you're not actually believing that actually what it is, what the church believes what it is, you could make an argument that'd be okay, right? But I would talk to the pastor, your pastor, before you do that. Just make sure the circumstances are to the point where that'd be okay. Right? I mean, like especially if like the best man, your friend who's a Lutheran or whatever.
Yeah.
I can understand that in some respect. But the same respect, the same thing wouldn't necessarily happen for us. Like, so if we had and this is kind of the different maybe the dividing point. Let's say we had a faithful Lutheran that came here to Mass at St. Gabriel. And what I always have like a line I say for weddings and funerals. I say, well, as long as you're a baptized Christian, you believe what the church believes about the Eucharist, namely it's the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ truly present in the appearance of bread and wine, consecrate the hands of a validly ordained priest, and that you're in a state of grace, you are eligible to receive, right? That's all that's necessary to receive in the Catholic Church. Now, the question though is, do you understand what all that means? Right? And if you don't, you can receive a blessing, you don't come at all. But if you really understand all of this and you truly believe it, you're eligible.
I see.
But then the question would be, well, if you do believe this, then what's keeping you from actually becoming Catholic? Right? Because even like a state of grace, that is subjective in some way, right? Because you have to understand, state of grace means you're not just a state of mortal sin. And that means you understand that what you do is wrong. You have that full knowledge it's wrong, and then you do it anyway, right? So something I do is wrong. I know it's fully wrong, and I do it anyway. So you could make an argument that someone is in a state of grace and not Catholic and haven't done sacramental confession because maybe they didn't have the understanding,
right?
Which we find in RCA quite a bit, right? We have a guys in RCA. The question comes up like, well, I've been going to Mass with my spouse. I believe all this, so can I receive communion? It's like, well, technically you could, but I would advise you to like wait though, because it's kind of special on not only on Easter Vigil, but also you may have a deeper understanding of your own actions.
Right. And
so therefore you have to confess it. Right. But yeah, it's kind of one of those, every year is kind of one of those things like, well, I mean, if you wanted to, you could, I guess, if you feel you're in that state.
Very cool.
Yeah. So yeah, it gets kind of complicated, but that's why the circumstances really come into play. So we always be mindful of that and respectful of other people's traditions too. So
very cool.
Yeah. But yeah, if you went to any Orthodox church and you received communion, we'd be, yeah, that's cool, no problem. But like I said, the issue would be want to be respectful of the place where you're at. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I mean, also too, sometimes you may not even know if it's even Catholic or Orthodox.
Yeah.
Because if you went to some of the Eastern Rite Catholic, divine worships, they call them, you probably won't tell the difference between that or Orthodox.
Okay.
They're pretty much exactly the same. Which is another reason why it's like, well, why can't we just together? What's keeping us from doing that, right? So yeah,
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I had a good buddy of mine who he's Mormon, and we've had a lot of discussions because that's a one I tried to bend my head around.
Yeah, I worked with a Mormon guy who was a really great guy. He would say he was a bad Mormon because he liked caffeine and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, caffeine.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, my buddy, he never drank or smoked, but he chugged Mountain Dew. It's like, I guess we all have our vices, you know what I'm saying?
And I was like, oh, well, whatever. I mean, I don't judge, whatever. But yeah, it's funny. I didn't really know much about it. He would tell me they would have 7 sacraments too.
Yeah, because my best friend, he grew up Catholic. Actually, his family was Catholic. He's even Catholic, I think, 2 or 3, and then his entire family converted to Mormons.
Wow.
I guess it was a very good sell, ministry. I think everybody in that church at some point is a
missionary.
Yeah, missionary.
Yeah.
And he did his work too, and he converted to. He doesn't remember being Catholic.
Yeah. He was baptized and stuff too.
I think he must have been.
Yeah. It's interesting because, like, I know they have something like the baptism of the dead. Like, yeah. So the way the Mormons do it, they do all the 7 sacraments like at once, and they actually do it for people that have already deceased who are not living. Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating thing. The problem, though, and this is where we kind of divide, their understanding of the Trinity is not in the same traditional Christian understanding of the Trinity.
Really?
So yeah, so Mormons take more of a Arian approach to Jesus. So Arius back in the 3rd century, he basically was promulgating that Jesus was just a man. He wasn't actually God, but he just happened to be the best created man, highest created man, right? By God.
Okay.
So it's almost like a second Adam in some way, but you're still human nature, didn't have divine nature.
Okay.
The Mormons kind of take the same approach. They look at Jesus as this great, the highest form of man you can possibly get, but doesn't reach the point of God. He's still created.
Really?
Even the Holy Spirit's created, and they have this understanding of this even divine mother, who was also kind of created and then conceived Jesus. It was very
Interesting.
It's very Arianistic, and so you can see a lot of these heretical roots. But I mean, Mormons live a good life. They do good work, and a lot of the social issues we would say, yeah, we totally agree upon.
Yeah.
Even they have 7 sacraments, great.
Of the dead is interesting.
Yeah.
How do you get sacraments when you don't necessarily give consent?
Right. Well, that's where we would say, yeah, you'd have to do that. And not only that, but we also understand sacraments are not for the dead.
Right.
Right. At that point, God will take care of you
Right.
in that respect. So yeah, there's some not only philosophical, but also some theological consistencies. We'd be like, well, no, that's. I mean, their main kind of basis in the faith is that they believe that the Native Americans came here they're actually from Jerusalem, and they sailed here before the time of Christ or around the time of Christ, and that after the resurrection, Jesus appeared here in North America to them.
Well, didn't they also have a tenant that did the Garden of Eden somewhere here in Missouri?
Yeah, apparently St. Joseph, Missouri. Yeah, and that probably is because I think Joseph Smith was, when he came here, he kind of saw the lushness of the area and figured, oh, this must be where Eden was. Although Genesis really says specifically that, well, Eden can't be accessed by humanity anymore.
Right.
So it's like, well, okay, whatever. So yeah, there's a lot of things. If you look at the history, their theology, there's a lot of problems. I mean, historically speaking, too, one of the things, and you ever watch South Park? You see the episode about the woman. So that actually is kind of true, that there was this kind of these stones that he had that he was reading out of a hat.
Right.
And he gave the translation to Brigham Young or whoever the guy was. Young gave it to his wife. His wife kind of hid them and then told him to go back and have them retranslate. And so, well, I can't translate this one, I got to translate those other stones, and it was completely different. So yeah, there's some like logical, like, okay,
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so maybe.
So it was prophet?
Yeah, there's a Joseph was a prophet, yeah. Right. Yeah. So like I said, we would even say that that's why if Mormon wanted to convert to Catholicism, we would have to baptize them.
Okay.
Because the understanding of the Trinity is not there. Right.
Yeah, I didn't know if they didn't consider Jesus divine.
Right. Yeah, their understanding of the Trinity is different than the Christian. I mean, there's even arguments made like even Baptists. Like Baptists would say that, like, what's kind of interesting, ironic there too is they have no understanding of the Trinity, but like they would say that you don't have to be baptized. So baptism is more still a symbolic action of an internal disposition. Okay. And okay, I mean, I'm fine, but they still do the water, they still do the Trinitarian formula. Okay. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting to see these kind of different theological perspectives.
I mean, I enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good discussion. I think part of it is also trying to figure out, okay, where do we actually align?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Because we do it a lot.
Absolutely.
It's just, but you can build off that, but things like the Trinity can be pretty basic. And it's like, well, if you don't understand, if you don't have the same belief of the Trinity that we do,
that's pretty cool.
That's an issue. Yeah. Right.
So with the Garden of Eden being inaccessible, obviously it's cast out, right?
Right.
So the Garden of Eden technically take place on Earth, or is it an astral plane? I mean,
No, I think you
we
would
don't-
take different aspects of that. I think we would say the fundamentals view is that, yeah, it was a place on Earth, and it probably was in the middle of Mesopotamia.
Right.
Right. But then after the fall, well, that area became desert, like, there's still crescent areas around the Tigris Euphrates.
right,
And those rivers were mentioned in Genesis too.
right,
So it's like, well, it must be around that area somewhere.
right.
But whether there was an angel guard or it basically was, thrown over by the desert because of that fall, well, okay, that could be possibly too. Or it was just was a figurative place. It was just kind of the center, basically going to be a center of creation.
Create a community.
Yeah. Okay. Well, regardless, either way, it's like, well, yeah, it could be all three. I mean, who knows?
True.
Yeah, I mean that's where we rely more and more on archaeology, kind of scientific method
Oh, sure.
to kind of figure out those things too. So yeah.
Well, I like to think about stuff too, but I hate to think that I'm moving toward the point of it. I think it's like a heresy to think this way.
Yeah, I
I'm like,
mean,
how far can you push that before
Well,
you really push yourself into a danger?
yeah.
That's-
And when we talk about biblical theology, if you read a lot of the stuff, there's really nothing. There are certain things that are official that have been promulgated by, like, you have to assent this with your mind and heart to certain things. But when it comes to interpretations, the church takes a very broad aspect on a lot of these things.
Oh, well.
Yeah. And so especially in the Old Testament with things like Genesis and some of these old, there are different things you can hold and say, okay, I'm still faithful Catholic. Right. So again, you could just like you could say, yeah, I believe that it actually took 7 days for the universe to be created. Okay. And you can say, no, I actually believe it took over millions of years. That's more figurative
Right.
reading. Okay. Right. You can still call yourself Catholic and believe both those things.
Yeah.
There's a pontifical biblical commission that kind of puts certain things out, but they don't necessarily have the force of law. So what's promulgated by them is not necessarily what would be considered dogmatic, or unless the Pope says specifically something. But when you look like biblical interpretation, the Pope doesn't really say a lot. So in reality, you're kind of like, okay, there's a lot of interpretations you really could make. Even our Protestant brothers and sisters can give something like, okay, we can see it, we can square that. See how that works in there too. Yeah.
Have you read the book of Canon Law? Are you looking for that?
Oh no, well, I've read it when I was in seminary. Actually, what's interesting is you would think this would be the most driest course that you would ever take, but it's actually the teacher we had was actually made it really, really fun. You probably know Monsignor Ramacati.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He teaches at the seminary Canon Law, and it is a riot. He does it so well. He can actually approach it in a way that's digestible, understandable, and actually kind of fun. As a matter of fact, I know a guy in Curia is like, go take a class with him, like, you're gonna love it. So yeah, he does a great job of it. But yeah, I've read the pertinent section. There's a couple courses of Canon Law that were optional that I should have taken, and I just couldn't take it at the same time.
Of course.
I would like to probably go back and look at it, but yeah, for the most part, I think I've read most of it.
Now, what does it take to become like a canon lawyer?
Yeah, so that would take 2 extra years at a particular university.
Oh, wow.
So you get an MDiv or an MA from seminary, and then you have to get an M, what they call a what is it, MTL, and that theological license licentiate.
Okay.
And then like you got like Monsignor, I think Monsignor got a doctorate.
Okay.
But he's also a judge, so it's kind of like one of those things where so yeah, you have to go for at least 2 more years.
When it comes to canon law, if you were canon law, were you mostly representing cases of like annulments, or what are the most common cases?
Yeah, annulments, unfortunately, laicization sometimes. Even when a priest, or deacon lose their faculties. Primarily annulments, I think now, but there's certain cases like when it comes to ecclesiastical goods, like let's say a parish gets folded into another parish,
Oh, wow.
and let's say maybe like a cross area where like the border kind of intersects or something. The question would be like, what would have to go to, because the parish then takes over the goods of that particular and closed parish. Where would that go?
Sure.
Right. Sometimes the tribunal have to get involved with that if there's a dispute. It's not like one pastor, no, that stuff belongs to us, another pastor, no, that belongs to us. Okay, have to bump that up to the tribunal to have that determination. Right?
Got it.
But that, yeah, primarily it's mostly annulment cases. You know.
That's curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, something I didn't even really know existed until my wife went to RCIA.
Yeah, like so Monsignor is on the appellate. So it used to be that if you got let's say annulment got granted by the tribunal, you would automatically have to go to appeal. Yeah, that was part of canon law.
Really?
Yeah, for annulment, because they would make sure that it was not a valid marriage, right? Now, Pope Francis recently, I think it was like 2015, he revised canon law to dictate that you do not have to go to appeal,
Okay.
right? Now, if you didn't get the agreement you wanted, you could,
right?
But that you have the option; you don't have to go through. It doesn't automatically happen.
Okay, I get it.
Right. And then if that doesn't work, you have the right to take it to Rome. Well, Rome is, as it was explained to me by Monsignor Ramicati, Rome is kind of interesting in the tribunal there because they typically, as a check of ballots, tend to side with the weaker argument sometimes. Like for instance, Archbishop Carlson has a great story about, oh, hi. It has a great story about when he was a bishop of, I think it was in Sioux Falls, or maybe it was St. Paul. He appointed a man as a pastor for a parish. This guy was like right out of seminary. It was very kind of like it was a growing parish. It was actually very vibrant. And once this man was appointed, the parish started declining. And so he was like, well, okay, well, you know, he went to the pastor side, I'm gonna have to move you. And the pastor said, we can't. So what do you mean? It's like, well, per canon law, it's not in the universal code, but for there's also canon law for a particular synod of bishops, particular regions. It's like St. Louis has its own canon law. It's in line with the universal code, but it's more particular to St. Louis. And then like the USCCB has a canon law that's more just particular for the United States. And so one of the dictates from the USCCB was that if a man's named pastor, they can't be moved within 6 years unless they agree with the bishop. Yeah. So Archbishop Carlson decided to take it to Rome, and the Roman Curia sided with the priests. Right.
Wow.
It's kind of like a check. Well, this guy does have the power. You have the power, so we're going to side with
I
him.
say good luck on your next assignment, sir.
Well, see, that's the drawback then, right? Because well, now we're going to be assigned next. But what actually happened from that though is Archbishop Carlson decided that he was not going to make a man for a first assignment. He won't make him a pastor until 1 or 2 years after they've been there for a while, and so he's making up what they call a pastoral administrator. Because canonically speaking, there's no force of law to the pastoral administrator. If you can move, we move. For the pastor, that's a canonical title, right? So yeah, that was kind of the main difference.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's just how that all works is just.
Is there anything in there is pertinent for like a lady to look at, or is it just going to be more for fact?
Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, there's particular codes in here when it talks about what the position of laity are. So when it talks about where is it here? Christian faith. So there's a whole section under Book 2, Part 1 called the Christian Faithful. And those are canons 204 through 329. And it talks about all the formation of clerics as part of that, because it comes from the lay people. But it also talks about like, common norms, public association, private association with Christian faithful, association with laity, like a different organization of laity. And that's all kind of within structure of what they call the people of God. So there's that particular section talks specifically about what the role of the laity would be. And I would say specifically from 298 to 329. That'd probably be very pertinent to lay people, those canons. Yeah, the rest of it is more about the hierarchical nature of the church. Yeah. So I would probably look at those. Cool. Yeah. I mean, it goes into other depth too, like part also in the sacraments. There's a whole section on Book 4 And that goes from 840 to 1165. So it's a huge bulk of canon law. It's just about the sacraments, right? So some good stuff in there about that. You know.
Is that ever rewritten or revised?
So this is the 83 code. This is the last universal code that was written, and this took the place of the 1917 code. So it kind of puts in perspective, right? So 1917, 1983. We're probably due for another one in about, I don't know, maybe 20 years or so. But then more of the particular codes, like the different jurisdictions, they can be updated on a more regular basis, right? Because those are more pertinent pastorally to particular situations, right? But they all flow from this. So like for instance, we were just talking about this situation with a pastor. This defines what a pastor is. It doesn't say in here though that a pastor is mandatory for 6 years in a parish once they're named. That's more particular law for a particular region, right? But that can be derived from this because there's nothing explicitly in here about that, right? Or it could actually, a particular law could actually make it more strict, right? But it can't loosen it. That's another thing we could probably see. That's actually also in canon law too, right?
Is there a group of hierarchy that meet to revise that?
So there's the Vatican Tribunal. So for instance, like Cardinal Burke was in charge of that, right, for a particular time after he left St. Louis, right? And he would be in charge of looking at those things and seeing if they need revision, all that kind of thing. But primarily, the main legislator of those is the Holy Father. He can basically dictate canon law how he thinks fit, or he can even renounce some of it, right? Contradict or not contradict, but remove it. That's all to him how he wants to do that, right? So like I said, he did that already when it came to annulments. So it used to be annulments had to automatically get appealed, but the Holy Father said, no, not gonna do that anymore. Okay. So even though it may be in here, it's no longer in effect because the Holy Father has stated so. That's why it's important to keep on. Now it may be, that's the thing. Now that may be taken into account, and they'll in about 20 years they'll revise it to kind of incorporate all those things. But this wouldn't necessarily happen. Everything happened from 1983 on. That's been revised by one of the three popes we've had.
Amazing.
Yeah. Our church is actually very flexible. You wouldn't think that, growing up in the Catholic Church, because you would think, well, we have all these rules, and look at this, this whole thing, right? But also,
And 9/10 of it, we don't know.
well, that's the thing. I mean, and this is all meant also to be pastoral, right? The whole point of this is that it actually applies pastorally, right? And we also understand when it comes to legislation, these are for general issues, right? But there are exceptions. And I think the problem sometimes a lot of people think they're the exception, not the rule. When in reality, they're probably not. It's a lot of things. I think we're seeing that more with annulments, though. I think there are a lot more exceptions just because there's been such a lack of understanding of what marriage is. And even a lack of maturity in going into marriage, understanding what you're saying yes to.
Right.
Which is why there have been so many annulments, because I mean, the ones I've been involved with so far, there was a really clear lack of we didn't understand this, right?
Do you think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on the pre-Cana, like those classes, or what? How do you?
Yeah,
get people to emotional?
I think it starts there, but I mean, also too, even within that, I mean, you can maybe have the best pre-Cana, preparation that known to man, but also. I know there's certain, when we talk to couples about this, they could be lying to me.
You're right.
I mean, I'm going with what they're telling me, but I don't know what's in their heart, in their mind. And so even though they said, yeah, we're good for the children, they're like, yeah, but well, maybe they're not. Well, that's grounds for annulment. Right? Or they put limitations on it, yeah, I only want 2 kids. Well, all right. But there may be circumstances where only 2 children might work and you only can have 2 kids. Okay, but that's different than I'm planning to only have 2 kids.
Right.
Okay, that's not really what we teach, right? And most of, I mean, and when we think about it, when we talk about you require 6 months for, this formation process. Wow, I mean, 6 months for a lifetime. I don't know if everyone is fully aware or what may come up or what's really being expressed. And because part of it is that we understand, at least in Latin, right, that it's the two discerning each other and they're saying yes to each other. I'm just there to witness, right? That actually was done right. That's all I'm really saying. They said the words. From what I gathered, they were in the right mindset when they did. From what they told me, that's all I'm really witnessing to. Right? But if later on there comes up, yeah, she never really wanted to have kids. She said she did, so I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm working on one right now with somebody, and it was from what this person was saying is that their spouse was basically just saying, well, I felt I had to do this. This is the only way I could actually find a life, and it was stable. I mean, I didn't really love this person. It's just that I felt I had to do this. Well, that's being compelled. That's not a free will choice. And even though you thought that was the case, even objectively may not be, if you're in that mindset, that's not a free consent. So
But
it's pretty
apparently in the time of our grandparents, that was often the case.
Well, and I think part of that too is there was a level, I think, that is being lost in some way of the trust and the grace of the sacrament. I think of it this way. I mean, I think we look at our vocations. Part of the wonderment of the vocation is realizing what you're saying yes to, right? So, like, for instance, if a man is going through ordination or a woman go through consecration, they're taking these vows and pledging their life to the people they serve. But you don't know exactly every circumstance it's going to be in. Like, I didn't know there was going to be a 2-year pandemic when I said yes to serving the people of God, but that was obviously what I said yes to, right? Because it happened. That came to fruition. That came to reality, right? So I think that's what we look at vocation, whether it be marriage or holy orders. That's one of the wonderment and amazement of the sacrament is that you realize, oh, I said yes to this. Right? There's an acceptance of the cross in that, which is the grace of the sacrament. But unfortunately, I think we live in a society that doesn't really either value that or doesn't really understand it, or I don't know. I really don't know. I think a lot of it may be narcissism, and there's a lot of that going on too. And that was even probably in our generation before, I think our generation a little more live and let live, and that also was maybe more of a problem too. It's more just kind of like well, whatever works for you may work for me or may not, whatever, just let it go and see what happens. Well, that's not really a good discernment either. And I mean, when we look at this, a lot of this comes down to a subjective mindset. Well, what were you thinking when you were saying these things? Or what was your understanding of this? And what you tend to find out is like, oh, you didn't really have an understanding, or maybe you were flat out lying. You said you were going to, and you didn't really have that intention. All right. Makes it easy. But yeah, it's heartbreaking in some ways. I mean, because that's one thing the annulment process is designed to do. It's designed for healing and closure. But it's also can be painful. You're kind of scrutinizing your life and saying, where did this go wrong? Where did I go? And also, what was my contribution to it? And that can be difficult for people to actually recognize that. But it's meant for good. It's meant for good closure and healing. And you have to do that in order to receive that healing. So, it'd be nice if they were all like the ones I had recently, which is a lack of form. Those are easy. You have a Catholic party, get married in the Catholic Church. Okay, fine, great, easy, done. Very simple. Cut and dry. But even that's like, I think, lack of understanding too. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize that I'm supposed to marry the Catholic Church. Why can't I just go to justice and peace? Well, because you're bound. That's what this says. You're a baptized Catholic, which means you have to get married in a proper form. That means in the context of a church witnessed by a priest. Unless you get that dispensed, but you can do that too.
Oh.
But if you didn't do that, there's no form.
But isn't in other countries, there's a civil wedding and a sacramental wedding?
More that's a cultural tradition though. That's not something that's actually sanctioned by the church. So like I know in some Spanish speaking countries, and I think even in Italy, it's common they would go to just the piece first to actually combine their stuff. So they
But
can
isn't that what
recognize.
makes it legal?
Well, so when we talk about marriage, there's three elements of that. There's sacramentality, there's validity, and there's legality, right? And just because something is legal doesn't mean it's valid or sacramental, right? So the question is how we approach it, which way we approaching this first? Well, we want to be all three. And so, yeah, so I can't marry anybody. I can't witness a marriage unless they have a marriage license. That's true. I can't do that. But what makes the marriage true is the fact it's done with proper capability, meaning I have my faculties. I know I'm saying yes to. Proper consent, I am actually expressing that consent. And the proper context, meaning the form is proper, is right. If one of those three is out of line, it's not valid.
See, all these years I've been telling my wife, because Monsignor Bomberito called her Dorsey, not Darcy. I told her, I'm like,
Well, again, here's
I'm
the question.
married to Dorsey.
Here's the question though. In your vows, when you made the vows, right? So, because that's the consent, right?
Yeah.
So if you said Darcy, if you say, I am Matthew, take you Darcy, that's it. Sorry, man, you're in there. I don't tell you. That's how it goes. They probably have a videotape of it too, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so yeah, sorry, you're
Never actually watched it. I'm sure it's out there somewhere.
sorry, you're locked in. You're locked in.
Yeah,
But then again,
yeah, pretty much.
you're pretty good. Yeah, yes.
Pretty fortunate.
Yeah, you're pretty good. Yeah, you did a pretty good job there. That was pretty good. Yeah. Yeah, no, but that's the thing. I mean, and that's why I talk with couples too. It's like this is really how we should understand marriage, and it is a lot of legal. There's a lot of legal language in it because it is a contract. Is it what we call it? It was a covenant, right? So it is a binding thing. But we want all three, and in these circumstances when people do that, that also makes some circumstances too. I mean, because part of that could be like, well, you know, I don't have any health insurance and he does. Oh, okay. Well, all right. That's reasonable. As long as you understand you're not actually married until you actually receive the sacrament. Right. I think for the most part, that's what's brought up. Yeah, that's the case for most people. But it has become a more cultural thing in a lot of Spanish-speaking countries, I think. But I think even then, though, they still realize I'm not married until we actually go through the ritual.
Now that pertains to Catholics.
Yes.
Non-Catholics, they're married.
Well, a non-Catholic is something different. So like there's always different scenarios. Let's say like you have two atheists who go to the Justice of the Peace to get married. Is it okay? If we look at three criteria: sacramental, valid, legal. Is it sacramental?
No.
No. Is it valid?
Valid in a legal way.
Well, we would even say it was a Catholic church. Yeah, it's a valid marriage.
Okay.
That's at least a natural marriage, right?
Okay.
They're still giving their consent, right? They're capable, they're giving consent in the proper form, they understand it.
Okay.
Because they're not bound by this, right?
Got it. Okay. I was wondering what level of validity.
Right. So in the same respect, then we say, like, let's say we have two Lutherans, baptized Lutherans, sacramental, valid, legal. Sacramental?
Can there be sacramental outside the Catholic Church?
Yes. Because what defines sacramentality is the fact that the two people changing the vows are baptized.
Okay.
Right?
That definition.
So baptism is sacramental,
Of course.
no matter what denomination
Correct.
is doing the baptizing.
That's why we don't rebaptize people, right?
Okay,
Yeah. So if you have two Lutherans get married in the Lutheran church, that's sacramental, that's valid, and that's legal.
so those two Lutherans couldn't become Catholic and marry somebody else.
So here's, okay, so let's say, so what you're saying is, if you had two Lutherans who got divorced, and this Lutheran over here meets a Catholic woman, let's say it's a man meets a Catholic woman, would we have to go and annul that marriage, actually have that witness that marriage? Is that what you're asking? Yes, we would. We absolutely would have to. Because we'd have to say, well, in your understanding of this, you were in the proper capability, consent, and forum. So what was lacking there that didn't actually make that sacramental? Didn't actually establish that bond? Now they could, you could maybe get a scenario where this Lutheran converts to Catholicism, and I want to marry this Catholic woman. You could say, well, okay, now you understand in a deep way what actually the sacrament of marriage is. We could do what we call it the Petrine privilege, but it's really a deference of faith argument. And you say, we have to go to Rome, and the Pope can say, yeah, you guys are good. Right? Because now if you're Catholic, you have a deference of the faith, the Catholic faith over the Lutheran faith.
That has to go to, actually has to.
The Roman metropolitan, the Roman tribunal has to give that consent. Yes. A local jurisdiction can just say, yeah, you're fine.
Oh, okay.
Now they could write to Rome and say, can you give us that, grant us that authority? Okay. But that it has to come from Rome regardless.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if there's no sacramentality to it, there
Mhm.
doesn't have to be, so if you have two atheists getting married,
Right.
they get divorced, one becomes Catholic, they can get married in the Catholic Church.
But we still have to know that
You
marriage.
still have to, and
Right.
but what if you can't because the other person says, that's stupid, I'm not doing it? If the
I mean,
party-
the other party, you don't have to be involved at all.
Okay. Interesting. I know nothing about.
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I know. The annulment process is really pretty robust. I mean, it's so a lot of times the other party's not involved.
Interesting. I didn't know that because was it always that way?
I don't know.
Because I had a friend.
Maybe in the
like,
17 code it might have
years
been.
and years and years ago that told me that they tried to get an annulment, but they were struggling with it because their husband didn't want to agree to or have to be bothered or didn't agree with the church's take on blah 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 blah.
Well, so part of that could be, let's say annulment's handed down and maybe one of the parties says, I want to appeal that. And they take all of the appeal process and they, that could be part of it too. I don't know. But you'd have to have a very good reason to say it's, I mean, if the tribunal said, yeah, this is not a valid marriage, and with the appeal process, they said, yeah, that's not a valid marriage. I mean, you'd have to basically send it to Rome at that point. And that could be where the issue is. I mean, either party has the right to do that.
I mean, how many cases actually make it to?
Not very.
I would say, because it seems like.
Now, some cases come here to St. Louis because different dioceses wouldn't necessarily have a tribunal. So we're considered the metro. We're actually a higher court. So if, let's say, something happened down in Springfield,
Okay.
and they went to their tribunal and said, yeah, we don't know this happens, they could send to St. Louis and have us to
So
do it.
backing it up. the
Yeah.
Tribunal, is it 3 canon judges then, or what is it? What is
No,
it?
it's just one judge.
This one.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if that's always been the case. I think it originally was, like in the 17th, I think it was 3.
Okay.
But now that's just down to 1.
I see.
The competent authority. And really that judge is actually representing the bishop.
Who would be the judge in our diocese?
The judicial vicar for our archdiocese is Father Benet. Yeah. He's related to Parishioners here.
The Benet family?
Yeah, the Benet family, cousins, I believe. Yeah. So Benet, he's a good man. He's a pastor over St. Joseph and Clayton. But he's also used for the archdiocese. So that doesn't mean he necessarily judges every case. There are other judges, right? Because sometimes he has to recuse himself, right?
Highest level.
Right. So it's like, for instance, let's say it was a relative of his. He would have to recuse himself. So another judge would have to be taking place.
Right.
So we have multiple judges. But when he signs off something, he's actually taking the position of the archbishop. He's representing the archbishop of those matters. So yeah, there's a lot of different processes too. Like there's like lack of form, there's disparity of cult, there's deference to the faith. There's actually this new process they're developing that where, let's say, both parties agree the annulment should be given. It's actually a very more streamlined process, and actually it's very quick.
And what does that mean, very quick?
Well, so a usual annulment takes maybe about 6 months to a year. This process, I think, gets done about 3 months.
Okay.
That's because both parties say, yeah, we both had a hand in this. This bond was never actually established, and so therefore, and it's only for 2 Catholic parties, so it wouldn't necessarily be for anyone else.
I'm sure children and everything else. Make it more complicated.
It can. I mean, so one of the big misconceptions people think things like, well, if I get known that invalidates my children. No, it doesn't. Your children still exist. They're still they're made God's image like this.
They're not
baptized.
illegitimate.
I'm sorry, guys.
Right, exactly. But I mean, the only time that would really come into play is if you were royalty. So this has very specific issues. Like, let's say you were a king and queen, you got married, had a child, you got annulled, and the king married someone else. Well, then who would actually then be the rightful heir of the throne? Yeah, it goes into that in not too much detail, but basically the only time would be really something to worry about.
That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, but for the most part, it's just like, yeah, whatever. Yeah. So yeah, so people tend to think, well, it's not illegitimate. It doesn't. Yeah. Unless if you're royalty, you maybe talk about it. Other than that, you're fine. No,
That's not much.
yeah.
No worries.
Yes.
No worries.
No blue blood in my veins. So
I was involved in a conversation about baptism. When a newborn is baptized in the newborn nursery because they're at risk,
yeah,
can they still be baptized in church?
they shouldn't be.
Can there be anything special?
Well, you could complete the rites, reading like maybe the different anointings, right? Because typically in an immersion baptism, you're doing the essential rite, meaning you're just pouring the water, saying the words, right? When we look at the actual full rite, right, there's a couple of anointings. Now you wouldn't anoint them with catechumen, right? Because that's already sailed. They're done with that. They've already exercised. It's fine. But you could anoint them with chrism, dress them in the baptismal garment, give them the light, the baptismal candle. Maybe do the epithet prayer. That'd be fine. You know.
So that anybody can essentially baptize in an emergency
Yep.
situation,
Mhm.
but it doesn't necessarily even have to be. Does it have to be holding water?
No.
It doesn't have to be.
Water. We use that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Water, as long as water.
Gotcha.
This wouldn't work.
No,
Milk wouldn't work. But like it has
that's
to be.
partly water.
It has to be clearly identified as water, right? So yeah, emergent situations, all bets are off, right? Do whatever you can do. But yeah, you could bring in the church and have the other rites just applied, but we wouldn't rebaptize that person because they're already baptized.
That's interesting.
Now, if there's a question about did I do it right, what we could do is conditionally baptize. And the only difference there would be instead of I baptize you in the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, I would say if you are able, I baptize you in the name of Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
I see.
Right.
But
And
is I'm sorry, go ahead.
Reading between the lines, that means if you haven't been baptized correctly, if you were able, means that.
Right. That would be if there's a question, maybe whether it was done right. So maybe if you were in an emergency situation, you really kind of frazzled, say, I baptize you in Jesus' name. And I come to you later, as let's say this whoever it was, they survived, and I say, oh, did you baptize him? Yeah. He's like, did you do it right? I'm like, I was really frazzled. I don't think I did. I don't know. Then we was okay. Let's just go conditionally baptize them. Like practically speaking, this really more happens in like let's say we have actually my first year I had to do this for a person because there was no record, there was no witness to the person's baptism, there was no even evidence that was even done the Trinitarian formula. So the person was like, yeah, I think it was baptized, but I don't have any record. And I was so young, I don't remember. And everyone that was there is now dead. Okay, let's just conditionally baptize you, right? And that's what we did. But regardless, we also understand there's the sacrament is applied through baptism by desire, right? So let's say you didn't do it right, the person dies. God is not going to condemn that person because you did it wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Intent, I guess.
Exactly. Right. So the God can does work in the sacraments. He's not bound by them. And so that's why we can say sacrament of desire can still apply there.
So, I don't know how to word this right. So I've obviously never had this happen, but if when COVID was in its highest, and I had somebody who's short of breath dying from COVID, he said, baptize me before I die. Still, that would be.
Oh yeah,
valid.
sure, right.
I always
Now-
think of it in my condition of like a newborn struggle.
Usually it is, but I mean, even in that circumstance, I mean, so like, let's say you got a priest there,
Mhm.
right? What I would do It was I baptize him, confirm him, and then give him the Eucharist.
Okay.
I would provide him all the sacraments of initiation, because in that circumstance, I have that authority to do that.
Sure.
Or otherwise, I have to get permission from the bishop.
To do all three at once.
Well, especially confirmation. Because confirmation has to be done by a bishop. He's the ordinary minister of the sacrament.
I see.
But in those circumstances, the church says all bets are off. Any priest can do that.
And on Easter Saturday, we were able to confirm.
By law, I can do that to anyone who hasn't been baptized Catholic already. So like for like, we had Sam Fisher, who came in. He was baptized Catholic. He's never completed the sacraments. So I had to get permission from the bishop to do him.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, because that makes sense because Darcy had not been baptized, so she was confirmed by Bonnie.
Oh, yeah, right, yeah. So she got all three of
She
that.
did.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
All three.
Yeah, and those are kind of the fun ones.
Yeah.
That's kind of the cool night for those guys. Yeah, that's pretty
We
awesome.
let her carry the papal flag in Corpus Christi. She felt like she was a big wig.
Which I think we're going to do the procession again this year. So
Oh,
on behalf of
cool.
everyone, I think we're going to be doing that. So
Nice. I love Corpus Christi.
we're also having the Monsignor just told me today we're having the Eucharistic Miracles are coming on the September 10th and 11th of this year. So they're going to have a presentation from 6 to 10 p.m. I guess in the gym of all the Eucharistic Miracles. And I'm not sure what that entails. He had a meeting today about it, so that'd be kind of neat too.
It's like a traveling thing? Or?
Yeah, apparently. Yeah.
That's cool.
I guess from the website of Blessed Carlos Acutis.
Really?
So he was just canonized, well, he was beatified. Well, he's been canonized. He was a first millennial saint.
Oh,
He was only 15 when he died.
Oh my gosh.
But he developed this webpage documenting all the Eucharistic miracles. That's out there today. It's all there.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What procession did we have about 5 or 6 years ago? Do you remember?
was it a Corpus Christi?
No, it wasn't a Corpus Christi. It was at nighttime. Oh,
Was it Holy Saturday, Holy Thursday?
no, this was like
What time of year was it?
I can't remember now. Shoot, I think it was like in September even. It was a traveling thing. They had like a statue and they
Oh, it could have been. I know they had Saint John Vianney
no, I think
relics.
it was a Mary. I think it was the Mary. I think it was the Mary of Saint Bernadette maybe. I don't know.
Well, September would have been the birthday of Mary.
I'll have to ask Darcy. She has better memory. for
Okay.
stuff. But we had a procession and the statue was beautiful and carried it through the neighborhood.
Well, there's also the naming of Mary.
Yeah.
There's a few Mary in
I'll ask Darcy now.
Okay.
If I think about it.
Okay. Could be. I mean, her birthday's on the 8th, and the naming I think is on the 12th.
Yeah, I love Corpus Christi.
Yeah.
And Ambrose, my family has always been the usher. Going back to my great grandpa was always the usher for the procession.
Actually, you know what? Was it the coronation of Mary?
May have been.
Because that would have been August 22nd.
May have been. I'll ask Darcy.
Okay,
She'll
yeah.
remember.
That could be because I know usually processions are done that day too.
Yeah.
That could be.
We used to have all procession. Before all the old timers passed, we always had like I think like Saint Rosalie had a procession.
That would be.
All the saints all had
Well, they
procession.
probably would have one coming up on Friday because that'd be Fatima.
Probably.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe bring the tradition back. Who knows?
You never know.
Yeah. Well, very good. Any other questions, comments, concerns, Harrisons?
Yeah, I like that. Very cool.
All right. Well, we'll shut it down for the day then. Thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you.